Let me invite you, if you would, to open up your Bible to the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 26. If you're new to the Bible, that's about 5/6 of the way through. If you don't own a Bible, there are red ones underneath the seat in front of you. If you want to grab one of those, we would love for that to be a gift to you if you don't own a Bible. But if you need to borrow one and you want to find the right place, if you turn to page 883, we are going to be this morning on pages 883 and 884. There is a church that I used to drive by. I don't know if they still have this sign out or not, but they had a sign out that, well-intentioned, I'm sure, said, "Try Jesus." And when I passed that sign, I often thought, I wonder quite what they mean. And even if you never saw that sign, you've probably experienced the sentiment behind it. See if Jesus works for you. Maybe if you give him a try, it might work out. It's what's called a pragmatic approach. And I'm betting that some of you have heard, maybe some of you have been told that, maybe some of you are in the process of doing exactly that. Let me try this Jesus thing and see if it helps my life or not. And I think how different that is from a young woman in our church who is trying to follow Jesus well in her school, and it's not easy. And how different it is from a man in our church who has given his life to Christ, and because of that, there has been a fracturing of relationships in his family and friendships. And this pragmatic approach to Jesus, it doesn't really work. And it doesn't work as a gospel strategy for us to say, try Jesus, you might like him. We set out this year with what we called our mission, and that mission was that we said we want to pursue the will of God, nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else. Some of our hardcore people have the shirt on sometimes. You can look around and see them. But we don't have to wonder what that mission is. There's really no mystery at all to what that mission is, because it rings throughout the whole Bible, but in numerous places, especially in the New Testament. The way this book ends is by laying out that mission, that we are to go to all the nations and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and understand that as we do that, that Jesus is going to be with us. He's going to be present with us as we do that. Our text this morning covers the two trials of Jesus. We are Thursday night into Friday morning of what's called the Passion Week, that last week of Jesus' earthly life. And our text lays out for us these two trials because they serve two different purposes. The first trial, as we're going to see, is a religious trial that is set before the chief priest and the council, and the second is a secular trial that is set before the Roman governor Pilate. And in a sense, every time we share the gospel with someone, or every time, if you don't know Christ, every time someone shares the gospel with you, we are, in a sense, reenacting this trial. We are deciding what we will ask of Jesus and what we will believe about what he says about who he is. And then deciding for ourselves what we will do about that and what he says, what it says about us. And so I want to begin just by laying this in front of you, and everything else that we're going to talk about is really to this end. I want you to understand this first. If we are going to be clear about the gospel, then that is going to come when we see that it's not us who tries Jesus, but Jesus who tries us. We don't put Jesus on trial, but rather in the gospel, Jesus puts us on trial. And so for those of you that are here and you are not yet a Christian, I want you this morning as you listen to do a couple of things, if I can ask this of you. I want you to consider what questions and judgments you are putting on Jesus in your current state of unbelief. I want you to ask yourself how open you are to his answers. And I want you to consider what questions and judgments Jesus is putting on you. And for my Christian brothers and sisters, I would say, I know that you have friends and loved ones, that you desperately want them to come to trust in the Savior. I know it because I hear from you every single week. I pray with you every single week about that son or that daughter or that father or that mother or that dear friend that does not yet know Christ, and you struggle and you are discouraged because of their disinterest. And I want you this morning to hear what our text has to say about how you share the gospel and how God uses it. So we're going to jump around just a little bit this morning, but I want to be able to trace these two trials. We're going to be skipping over some things we've already covered as we go. So I want you to look at Matthew chapter 26. I'm going to start in verse 57, read through 68, then we're going to skip over to part of chapter 27. It says, those who had arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had convened. And Peter was following him at a distance, right to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and was sitting with the servants to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false testimony against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they could not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two who came forward stated, "This man said, 'I can destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" And the high priest stood up and said to him, "Don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said it," Jesus told him. "But I tell you, in the future, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? See, now you've heard the blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who was it that hit you?" And skipping to chapter 27, verses 1 and 2. It says, "When daybreak came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And after tying him up, they led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor." Skip down to verse 11. It says, "Now Jesus stood before the governor. 'Are you the king of the Jews?' the governor asked him. Jesus answered, 'You say so.' While he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he didn't answer. Then Pilate said to him, 'Don't you hear how much they are testifying against you?' But he didn't answer him on even one charge, so that the governor was quite amazed. And at the festival, the governor's custom was to release to the crowd a prisoner they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Who is it you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew it was because of envy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judge's bench, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for today I've suffered terribly in a dream because of him." And the chief priests and the elders, however, persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to execute Jesus. The governor asked them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" "Barabbas," they answered. And Pilate asked them, "What should I do then with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all answered, "Crucify him." Then he said, "Why? What has he done wrong?" But they kept shouting all the more, "Crucify him." And when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that a riot was starting instead, he took some water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." All the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, and after having Jesus flogged, handed him over to be crucified. The first thing that I want us to see as we look at these verses is I want us to see the irony of this situation. I want us to consider the irony of everything that's happening here in judging Jesus. Life in a Roman-controlled world was not an easy life. Because the Romans, when they conquered a territory, so long as you paid your taxes and you were peaceful, they liked to let you do things the way you liked to do things. And so you've got, in one sense, the same council that had always governed over the people is still the council governing over most affairs. This council, the chief priest would have sat at the top of it. It would have been made up of priests and scribes and others. And that council was called the Sanhedrin. But the Romans withheld one thing. They withheld the ability for that council to put anyone to death. And because, as our text says, their greatest desire was that Jesus would be put to death, not only put to death, but as the crowd cries out, that he would be crucified. That form of death that was not only the most torture, but was also the most humiliating form that the Romans had. It was generally only reserved for insurrectionists and slaves. No Roman citizen could ever be crucified, but it wasn't enough to kill him. They wanted him crucified. So in order to do that, they had to then bring Jesus before the Roman governor. This Sanhedrin is overseen by Caiaphas, but the Romans had appointed him against the rules. They had appointed him to this position. There's another high priest. We see this in John. His name is Annas, and he is and would have been seen by most Jewish people at that time as the rightful high priest. But I want you to imagine for a second, just to put ourselves in the framework of everything that's happening here, I want you to imagine for a second that you go home tonight and you go to bed and maybe you wake up around midnight or 1 o'clock and you're a little hungry, so you go downstairs. And you open the fridge, and you're standing there at the fridge, and you're trying to find something small to eat. And as we age, it becomes harder because you got to think about indigestion and all these things we didn't have to think about when we were 20. But that's not the point. I'm losing the thread. The point is, you're standing there, and as you're standing there, the police barge in. And they take you, and they arrest you, and they take you not to the courthouse, not to the jail, but they take you to the judge's house. And gathered there is what can only be called a kangaroo court. There's no real legitimacy to any of what's going on. And before you get to breakfast time, you're already convicted of a capital offense. They've brought in a few false witnesses against you. You've been given no opportunity to say much at all. Matthew 26:59, it says that the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false testimony against Jesus so that they could put him to death. Now we know from the way things unfold that they weren't just looking for liars. That would have been easy. Otherwise, what's the point? But they had already concluded in their minds that Jesus was guilty. So they're looking for people that will support that conclusion that they had already arrived at. Today, we would call this confirmation bias. It's what we all do when we look at social media. And the social media algorithms know what you think, and so they're going to fill your mind with the things that just support that conclusion. That's what they're looking for here. And so they find these two men who say something that is in the neighborhood of true, but not true about Jesus. Because when Jesus says, tear down this temple and in 3 days I'll build it up, he's not talking about the literal temple. He's talking about his own body as the ultimate true temple, the place where God and humanity meet. It wouldn't have taken much for them to come to that realization that that's what he meant, but they don't want to because it would undermine their position. And so let me pause again and talk to those of you that don't know Christ, and let me say, if you have rejected Jesus because of what someone who you consider to be smart or someone influential over your life said about him, or because of what someone did who claimed to be affiliated with him, then I urge you this morning to look more deeply. So when Caiaphas asked Jesus' response, we see in verse 63 of chapter 26, it says that Jesus kept silent. He is fulfilling what Isaiah had written centuries before, that like a sheep before his shearers is silent, so would the Messiah be. We see the same thing when he's before Pilate. Look at chapter 27, verses 12 through 14 again. It says, while he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he didn't answer. And Pilate's flummoxed by this. He says, don't you hear how much they are testifying against you? In other words, don't you even care? Don't you want to defend yourself? Don't you want to say something in your own defense? But it says that he didn't answer him even on one single charge. Not one single charge. Now, we're going to say more about this in a minute, but partly this is because of the ridiculousness of this situation. That Jesus would be standing before these men put on trial. If you were to go out, I dare you to try this today. Go out on the street, go out just among regular people, go to Walmart. Interrupt someone, they'll think you strange, they might call security. And is there security at Walmart or is it just the police? I don't know. But anyway, you'll ask them and say to them, who is Caiaphas? And I bet you're going to get a lot of dumb looks. And if you said to them, who is Pilate? They'd probably say something like, who's Pilate? My Pilate? I don't, they said their name over the intercom when I was on the plane, but I don't remember what it was. They're certainly not going to know who either of these men are. But if you said, who is Jesus? You would have to travel pretty far and wide to find someone who doesn't know something about who Jesus is. In response to Jesus' silence, the high priest takes an oath. Talk about the height of ridiculous. His oath is essentially calling God as a witness against his own son. He takes an oath and he says, "Answer me. God is witnessing you." And here, Jesus answers because it is a legitimate question. He asks him the question. He says to him, "Tell me, are you," let me find it. He says, "Are you," here it is. "Tell us if you are," verse 63, "tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus answers in verse 64, "You have said it." You said it. It's true. It's the same exact response he gave to Judas when Judas said to him, "It's not me who's going to betray you, is it?" And Jesus said, "You've said it." It's the same response that he gives to Pilate in verse 12 of chapter 27. He's saying, "I didn't say it, but what you said is true." But I want you to take note of how he continues in verse 64 of chapter 26. I know you're bouncing around a lot, but stay with me. He says, "But I tell you, in the future, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." What you said is true, but it's not nearly full enough. So let me give you the full picture, and here's the full picture. After this point, you're going to look and you're going to see me seated at the right hand of power. What that means is that I'm going to be ruling with the authority of God. I'm going to be ruling with the authority of God. And then you're going to see me coming on the clouds of heaven. In other words, in the glory of God, you will see me coming to carry out my judgment. Don't miss what Jesus is saying here. Because he's saying, you may be sitting in judgment over me right now, but from this point on, I will be sitting in judgment over you. As a consequence of the judgment they make about Jesus, they will then find themselves being judged by Jesus. So let me say to you this morning, if you assume that your judgment of Jesus settles things for you, I would urge you to reconsider. Maybe someone told you to try Jesus. Or they told you, Jesus loves you. Don't you want to ask him into your heart? And you've concluded that, Jesus just doesn't work for you practically. You're very busy. So this whole Jesus thing, I might fit him in on Palm Sunday, Easter, Christmas, but this whole Jesus thing just really doesn't fit in my schedule. Or you might have concluded pragmatically that Jesus just didn't really make my life easier. Or maybe religiously you've said this whole thing about judgment, maybe right now as I talk about Jesus judging you, there's part of you that just says, that's offensive. I don't like that. I don't like that picture because religiously, I believe that my responsibility is to be as good a person as I can be and to hope that that goodness is good enough. So when you say that Jesus judges me, that is a cause of offense. Or maybe intellectually, some of you have said, I just find all these supernatural answers a little too easy. And I want to say that person who invited you in those ways, no doubt lovingly, unintentionally gave you the wrong sense of your relationship to Jesus. Because, as I said before, the only time you're going to see the gospel clearly is when you see that it's not that you put Jesus on trial, it's that Jesus puts you on trial. Have you ever played the game, maybe you went to a party or whatever, ever play the game Two Truths and a Lie? It's like one of those ways that we get to know each other, and you're supposed to come up with two truths about yourself, the crazier the better, and then a lie. And usually you want the lie to be a little bit less crazy than it could possibly be. And I want to kind of structure the rest of what we're going to be seeing this morning this way. I want you to see that Jesus is going to answer a question from both of his judges with some very important truths. And I want you also to see where he doesn't answer. And then lastly, I want you to see that Pilate and the crowd are going to respond with a lie. And so two truths I want us, and I'm really in this point, I want to say to those of you that are here and you don't yet know Christ, this point is really mostly not for you. But to those of you who are Christians and you seek to tell others about the gospel that saved you, as any true Christian does, then I want you to consider when and how we are to answer. So what truths do we say about Jesus that we see from this passage? Well, I would say first, we need to say what I've been harping on now for about 15 minutes. And that is, the gospel, we must say, number one, that Jesus is coming as a judge. Jesus is coming to judge sinners just like you and me. And he is coming in the righteousness and the power and the glory of God. If we don't start there, then we're all tempted to say, well, next to a lot of people that I know, I'm a pretty good person. If we don't start with the fact that Jesus is coming not to judge whether or not you're a good person in relationship to me, but whether you're a good person in relationship to God, then that reframes everything about the gospel. But number two, we need to say, even as Jesus does in answer to these questions, when he answers Caiaphas, he is saying, yes, I am the Messiah. I am the Savior. And when he says that, he's saying, I am God's chosen means, his only chosen means by which someone can come out from under the curse of their sin, can stand before the righteous judge and find salvation. And then he says number three, and we see this in his response to Pilate, Jesus is saying, yes, I am the Lord. I am the King of the people that God has set his affections on. And if we're going to accurately share the gospel with anyone, these are three essential parts. These are the three essential parts. And we see all three of them in our text, yet I find that they are often left out. They're often left out. Why? Because we know that the people that we're talking to, they don't like them. They're offensive. And we don't want to offend them. We want them to like our Jesus. We don't want them to reject him. And so we want to leave them out or wrap them up in as big a pillow as we possibly can. Romans 9:33, it says, look, I am putting a stone in Zion to stumble over and a rock to trip over. The gospel is always, when properly communicated, it's always offensive. So when they are offended, how do we answer? I would say this. Number one, what we see from Jesus' example is that legitimate questions that are illuminating truth are answered. Questions like, who is Jesus? What did he say about himself? What did he do? What does he say about me? Why should I believe? These are all legitimate questions, and Jesus answers them, and so should we. But number two, we find that illegitimate questions, those ones that are just confirming the rejection that someone's already arrived at, they are not answered. Proverbs 26 verse 4 is one of my favorites. It says, "Don't answer a fool according to his foolishness, or you'll be like him yourself." Jesus, it just makes me think of those endless back and forths that you see all the time on the internet. Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. He says, "Don't give what is holy to dogs, or toss your pearls before pigs, or they will trample them under feet, turn and tear you to pieces." In other words, there's a right time not to bother answering. So if we were to say just what are a few lessons on sharing the gospel, I'll say this and then I'll move on. Number one, I would say, just don't bother with questions that come with a sneer. If you're trying to share the gospel in love with someone in your life and their response comes with a sneer, there's no need to really move forward. I would say number two, when you share the gospel, give the whole gospel. Give all of it. And then number three, I want you to see that Jesus deals differently with Caiaphas than he deals with Pilate, than he dealt with the woman at the well, than he dealt with anyone else. And so ask God to give you insight. Anytime you see something that says one size fits all, that really means it doesn't really fit anybody, right? And Jesus never uses a one-size-fits-all approach to sharing the gospel. Every person he dealt with slightly differently, but always driving at these core things about the gospel. So for those of you that are here and you don't know Christ, I would just say again, what you do with those truths about Jesus matter. And I want to encourage you this morning to not respond by lying to yourself. By lying to yourself about who Jesus is, by lying to yourself about what who Jesus is says about who you are. But you would deal honestly with it. So number three, I want us to see as quickly as I can the problem of lying to ourselves. And the two forms of lying to ourselves that we see in this text are common. Number one, that Jesus is no threat. Number two, that I am innocent. So lie number one, Jesus is no threat to my self-rule. Because that's what sin is, ultimately. Sin is always saying, I'm the one that's in charge of me. I want to do what I want to do, not what God wants me to do. That's the nature of sin. But to look at Jesus and say that who Jesus is threatens in no way that desire to rule over my life, that is a lie. That is why at both trials, when you see the results, they mock Jesus. At both trials, they beat him. At both trials, they spit on him. What they're doing is they're demonstrating the fact that Jesus has no glory. He has no honor. He has no power. They believe that Jesus is no threat to them. But I want you to see, that part seems easy. I want you to see the part that's often misunderstood. I want you to understand that the way Pilate responds is also evidence of a man who sees Jesus as no threat. This story is well known, this story of Barabbas and Pilate offering to the crowd, I'll let Jesus go or I'll let Barabbas go. And we've got on one side this man Barabbas that we know from Matthew and from the other gospel accounts. We know that he was very likely the ringleader of the other two criminals that end up hanging on either side of Jesus. The three of them were arrested together. They were insurrectionists. It's an unfortunate translation to just say that they were robbers or they were thieves. They were more than that. They were insurrectionists. We know from Mark's gospel that Barabbas, in an insurrection, had actually murdered someone. And that's why he's been arrested. It says that he was a renowned man. People knew that he was dangerous. And so Pilate says, here's Barabbas on the one side, or here's Jesus on the other, who, yes, claims to be the king of the Jews, which was a capital offense, because they would look at it and say he's setting himself up in opposition to Caesar. But Pilate looks at Jesus and says, he's got no army. He hangs out with fishermen and women and children. What threat is he to anyone? So he lifts them both up, and I think he is shocked when the crowd chooses Jesus, or chooses Barabbas, rather. There's a book that just came out. It's called Believe by a New York Times columnist. And he details in there, and it'll shock some of you, this columnist is a believer in Jesus. He details a conversation in that book between him and Christopher Hitchens, a former atheist who is now only former because he has passed away. And this conversation happened at a party, and they were talking in the kitchen, and Hitchens responded to the author and said, so what would it really add up to, honestly, if Jesus had risen from the dead? And the answer should be obvious. It matters everything if Jesus really did rise from the dead. But you see, just like Pilate, Nietzsche, he hated Jesus because of his weakness. Some of the earliest graffiti that we have from the Roman Empire is graffiti on a wall mocking Jesus, hanging on a cross with a donkey's head. He seemed as weak as one could possibly be. But I want you to see this morning that if Jesus is who he said he is, and the cross and the resurrection reveal him to be, and you and I are still under the guilt of our sin before him as a righteous judge, then Jesus is the most dire threat you or I could ever face. The second lie is that we are innocent. When the crowd answers Pilate's complaint, what has he done wrong with crucify him? Pilate, a Roman, uses a Jewish tradition to take out a basin of water and wash his hands as though a ceremonial cleansing to demonstrate to the people that he thinks he's innocent of the whole affair. But he isn't. And neither are we. Isaiah 53:6, it says, we all went astray like sheep. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of us all. Misjudging Jesus leads to misjudging ourselves. Pilate has a great deal of insight into others. It says in chapter 27 that he could see that they were motivated by envy. But he seems to have very little insight about himself, just like many of us. And the crowd in Matthew's gospel has almost always been a picture of a bad influence that pushes you towards unbelief. Jesus said back in Matthew chapter 7, he said, you need to enter in through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. How narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and few find it. So I want to say to you this morning, be wary of the influence of the crowd. Just consider the answer of the crowd in verses 24 and 25. He says in verse 24, I'm innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. And all the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children. They are so caught up in their sin and their hatred of Jesus that they welcome the curse. And I wonder if it's possible that you might be there or near there. Is your loved one there? And if so, I want to say there's still hope. There's no roster of who was standing in this crowd and who was standing in the crowd when Peter preaches his sermon on Pentecost, but I have to believe there was overlap. I have to believe some of the same ones who cried out, crucify him, were also there saying, what must we do to be saved? And I say that to say to you, all is not lost for your loved one. God saves those, even those that hate him. Jesus still takes our place. I'm going to end on this, but I want you to consider this. When Jesus goes to the cross, as we're going to see Friday night, and he hangs on that middle cross, that was the cross prepared for Barabbas, not for Jesus. When he hangs between the rebels, he's hanging there in the place of Barabbas. He is literally hanging on that cross in his place. He is being the substitute for the rebel. So I want you to know this morning, if you are guilty or your friend or loved one are guilty, I want you to rejoice that Jesus hung in the place of the guilty. Religious people are offended by Jesus. Secular people want to wash their hands of him. What is it that offends you about him? What makes you think he's not a threat? Church, I want to say, we cannot reduce the gospel down to some kind of easy to believe, pragmatic kind of faith. I'm convinced part of the reason we struggle in sharing the gospel is because we send it into the fight with both hands tied behind its back. I want us to commit as a church and as a family to share the whole gospel in love, trusting that God will do the work even as he always has, and to feel confident. In our own goodness, we all stand condemned, good and bad, great and small. We are all Barabbas. But praise be to God, Jesus hung on the cross of Barabbas.